Hey, fellow bookworms. It's my privilege to introduce you to our guest today, Penny Hawkins Smith, author of Influencing Death, Reframing Dying for Better Living. Penny is a writer, a speaker, and a TikTok creator who is gently and powerfully normalizing conversations around death. Through her deeply personal story and compassionate insight, she invites us to look at death as not something to fear, but as part of life that can be embraced with curiosity, honesty, and even peace. In her memoir, Penny shares how confronting death head on after years of personal and professional experience with grief, loss, and end of life care became a pathway to deeper presence, healing, and joy. The courage she brings to the page and to her growing TikTok community is nothing short of inspiring. I'm so honored to welcome her to For Love of Memoir. Hi, Penny. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm
Hi,
thrilled
thank
to have you on. I so admire your work and what you do and putting yourself out there and teaching people about death and normalizing the conversation around death. I think it's something that's super important that we could use a whole lot more of in our society. So thanks for coming on.
agree. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought maybe we would just kick it off with you. Tell us a bit about yourself. How would you introduce your story to someone who doesn't know you yet?
Well, my story's a long story because I'm old, but basically, I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with 20 years of experience, and I've worked in many different areas of hospice. In 2020, during the pandemic, I found my way to TikTok and decided one day to post a video about a patient story. And it went viral, and I realized that people really wanted to know more about death and dying, and I had the answers. So I've always been very passionate about educating and normalizing death and dying, being with families and seeing how their fear can be relieved by just telling them what their person is going through is normal, has really just inspired me to want everybody to know that. And I've just always loved that's been my favorite part of hospice nursing is educating people and explaining to them that the things that they're seeing are perfectly normal, their person's okay, this is a natural process. So being able to do that kind of on a larger scale through TikTok has been really rewarding for me.
Sure, and it takes a certain kind of personality to be able to do that as well. All the compassion that you put forward with every single patient every single day. I can imagine that there are challenges that come up with that.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it takes a mix of compassion and also not being afraid to kind of go there with people, being able to feel people out for what they can handle and pushing it a little bit further each time, getting over the
Sure.
line a little bit more because it's a difficult subject to talk about. People don't want to talk about death. It's sad and scary, and it's always going to be sad when your person dies, but it doesn't always have to be scary.
Mm,
So, yeah, you have to have the right blend of compassion and what's it called? Chutzpah?
right.
Chutzpah.
Well, none of us are getting out of it, right?
Right,
That's what they
exactly.
say, death and taxes.
Exactly. Yep. None of us get out of
So,
here alive.
what was the catalyst to writing your memoir? What made you decide to write a book?
Well, I've had an interesting life. My mom used to tell me all the time, you have a book in you. And when I started working in hospice, I was so fascinated by the dying process. Before I went into hospice, I had death anxiety. I didn't have any concept of afterlife because I wasn't raised with religion. I rejected any kind of religious ideas about afterlife. And so I had a lot of fear around dying and going into hospice and kind of resolving that fear and watching people dying and just being fascinated with the process, I started to write stories about my patients. And in about 2018, I found this website that Amazon had created where you could write a screenplay and it formatted it for you and everything, and they would select amateur writers. And I told my sister one day, the television shows about medical care are just, I can't even watch them. They're just so phony. And there's nothing about hospice at all. So I think I'm going to write this screenplay. And so I started taking these stories from the hospice care center and putting them into this screenplay format, along with things about my life. And I was working on that, and then Amazon got rid of that. So I was like, oh. So I shelved it for a while. And then I got on TikTok and started telling stories and educating on TikTok, and people were telling me, you should write a book, you should write a book. And so I thought, okay, once I got to have about 100,000 followers, I thought, well, gosh, maybe I should write a book. Maybe people would be interested in reading a book. And so that is kind of what I took that screenplay and turned it back into stories, made a book out of it.
Everything happens when it's supposed to, and it's time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
In your book, it was a great book, by the way. I've read through it
Thank
a
you.
couple of times. I think it's something that we need more of, robust conversation around death and dying. But you did a really good job of blending your practical wisdom with the vulnerability of these stories. How did you select which stories to tell? Because I'm sure there are so many.
There are, and thank you for saying that because that was one of my concerns always when I was writing this book was making sure that it made sense and, you know, the juxtaposition of my personal life with the stories of my patients and how those stories impacted me. And I think I would say that I chose those stories because they were some of the most impactful situations that I could relate to my life that really changed my life. And really that's kind of how those stories came to be. They're the ones that have always stuck with me. They're the most memorable and they're most inspiring. And some of them are sad, but there's still like always a little bit of wisdom that you can gain from the stories. And so that's kind of how I landed on those. And I do have many, many more. And someday I might actually do a second revision of the book and add more stories into it. Because after it's published, I'm like, oh, I forgot about that one, because
Sure. Well, and I'm sure in all these conversations that you do, they continue to come up and up, new ones all the time. I'm sure.
yeah, yes.
You speak a lot about transformation, not just for the dying, but for the living. So, what do you hope that your readers will take away in terms of how they live after reading your book?
Well, I hope that people will have less fear around dying and less reticence to talk about it. I think that's one of the main things because when you have fear about dying, especially if you have it to the point where it's all consuming or crippling to you, it really prevents you from being able to live. Knowing and accepting about your mortality will help you to live better. It helps you to focus on your life more, to seize the day, take advantage of every moment, and be grateful for the time that you have. And I think that's probably the main thing I want people to get from it is like we should not fear death. We should accept it. It can be a beautiful experience. It's sacred. And we're all going to go through it. We're going to go through it with the people who we love. We're going to go through it with people who we just know. We're going to go through it with our own self. And so just being able to accept that makes the experience so much better and it helps you to live better too.
Wow, I think that's so true. I guess I had never really thought about, and it seems like there's a large number of people out there that really do suffer from death anxiety, and it probably impacts every decision that they make every
Yeah.
day, all day long, right? Things
Yeah.
that they
Yes.
wouldn't, that they'd miss out on for their fear of possibly being hurt or dying.
Yeah, true. And I didn't know that. Like I had no idea when I started social media is when I learned. I mean, I knew as going into hospice, I knew that people didn't want to talk about it, but I didn't know people had real fear around it like I did until I got on social media. And then just kind of hit on the things that I believe help with that through people who follow me saying, I used to be afraid of death and I'm not anymore since I started watching your content. I don't fear death anymore. So, it was really an eye opener for me.
Wow, good for you. I mean, like, check. Like if you can reach one person and make their life, a little bit easier or help to release a fear that they've been struggling with, I think that you have probably been more successful than most other people on the planet. So,
Well, and when it really matters is when, I mean, it's one thing to overcome your own fear around death so that you can just start focusing on your life. But when it's really important is when you are with someone who's dying, that fear can prevent you from really being fully present to what's going on. You can see the event as being really traumatizing instead of sacred and appreciating it. And so when people are writing me letters and saying, I knew what to expect, I wasn't afraid, I held my grandmother's hand until she took her last breath. I told my family what was going on. They all knew what was happening. It wasn't scary. We were there. It was beautiful. Like helping people to embrace that moment and see it as a beautiful thing instead of looking back and going, oh my gosh, it was awful. And I have so many regrets and I wish I would have stayed with them and I couldn't do it. And, it just really makes all the difference.
right. I can't remember if it was on one of your TikTok videos or if it's actually in your book that you were talking about how oftentimes families don't want to talk to the person who's dying because they don't want to bring it up and they feel like it's sensitive. And the person who's dying doesn't want to put that pressure on their family, but they really do want to talk about it. And so I imagine there are a lot of conversations that just go unhad and words that are
Absolutely.
unsaid because nobody really knows what to say or do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, they don't want to acknowledge the elephant in the room, that is that the person is dying. And
Yeah.
then comes in the, I don't want them to lose hope. I don't want them to give up. I don't want to make them sad. And the patient's always thinking, I don't want to make them sad. They're already sad. There's no
Right.
way they're not going to be sad about what's happening. And you can't cause someone to die faster by taking away their hope. And that's never what we want anyway. We want to try to help people reframe their hope and think about what else is meaningful to them at the end of life, not just hoping to live longer, but to live better.
Right. Yeah, I imagine, hospice is for end of life, right? It's to make people
Mhm.
comfortable at the end of their life. So I can't imagine that there are a lot of times where you see a patient turn around and walk out without dying. So it's kind of amazing how hard it is still for people to dig into the conversation, knowing that that's why they're there or that's why their loved one is there.
Yeah, yeah. And we do have patients who, you have to have a life expectancy of 6 months or less with a
Hmm.
terminal prognosis. And the um, the 6 months or less is just kind of like how we look at our benefit periods or the recertification process basically. So you have all these benefit periods and then
Mm.
you anytime that the person's on hospice, they have to have a life expectancy of 6 months or less. So people can be on hospice for 6 months or less than 6 months or a year or 2 years or 3 years, which doesn't happen as often. But if they during that time all of a sudden they improve and we think, oh, they're going to live longer than 6 months, then they're discharged alive off of hospice. They're still terminally ill, but they just have a longer life expectancy.
Yeah.
Rarely do we have anybody who actually goes off hospice and they're not terminally ill anymore. I've seen it twice in my career where people were actually, their cancer went away. One guy had a stroke. He completely recovered from the stroke and was no longer terminal. So that rarely happens. But yeah, so to your point, most people who go on hospice, that's
Mhm.
the expectation. They're going to die, and they're going to die within 6 months.
Yeah. I would love to hear you read an excerpt from your book. Did you pick one to read to us today?
Yes, I did.
Hear it. Please
All
dive
right.
in.
And this is from chapter 18, Grief and the Dynamic of Family Dynamics. Dan, I said firmly as I placed my hands on the shoulders of my patient's son, your mom is dying, and if you want to be with her, you have to stop getting in the way of her care. Although my experience as a bartender was vastly different from being a hospice nurse, I felt the encounters I had when working in bars helped me to feel less intimidated as I faced the towering giant of a man clad in black leather who stood before me. Or maybe it was just that I could see through the gruff facade to a little boy who was desperately grieving the inevitable death of his mom, a reality that was quickly approaching. But let's back up a few weeks. My patient, Mrs. Dahl, was in her 80s. She had previously lived in her own home with Dan, her youngest child, as her caregiver. Dan had never married, had no family of his own, and was currently unemployed. I got the sense from his mom that there had been quite a bit of coddling that had stunted his adulting ability. Mrs. Dahl also had a daughter, but she worked in a very high position in a bank and wasn't able to provide much care or even oversight of care. When I met Mrs. Dahl after she first came onto hospice, she was already bedbound, having suffered a broken hip from a fall. The history I'd gathered from the admit nurse was that Dan had been a little unrealistic about the fact that her capabilities were declining due to her advanced dementia. His encouragement for her to exercise by walking down and up the steep basement stairs had been the cause of her accident. Each time I went to see Mrs. Dahl, I found her in a worse condition. Her skin was starting to break down and she was developing open wounds on her buttocks. Although these wounds caused by pressure from a person lying in one position for too long can indicate neglect of a patient, this isn't necessarily the case for a person on hospice. The skin is an organ, and like all other organs during the dying process, it will begin to fail. Pressure ulcers can develop quickly, even with the best care possible. For me, the most troubling thing about the care Dan was providing was his reticence to give her any pain medication. He, like many family members of hospice patients, was worried that he would cause her to die faster by giving her morphine. I'll reiterate for the people in the back that this couldn't be further from the truth. We medicate people with opioids safely and judiciously, especially if they haven't had a lot of narcotics before. The dose of morphine that had been prescribed for Mrs. Dahl was very low, equivalent to a Vicodin, and less strong than a Percocet. I arrived to find her forehead creased deeply, a sign of pain we look for in people who can't communicate. Where's the morphine? I asked Dan. He played dumb, saying he couldn't remember where he put it until I pressed him into getting the little bottle for me. I tried my best to educate him on the safety of morphine and how much pain his mom was in. Dan, look at her face. Listen to her moaning, I said emphatically as I squeezed a small amount of liquid morphine from a syringe into her mouth. She's in so much pain. The social worker, Carly, and I finally decided we need to let Mrs. Dahl's daughter know about our concerns. Although her work had kept her too busy to have much involvement in her mom's care, she really stepped up and took charge once she realized the direness of the situation. Within a week, she had obtained custodial guardianship of her mom and transferred her to a nursing home where she could get better care. We thought having Mrs. Dahl safely ensconced in the facility would improve her pain management, but unfortunately, Dan was ever present and prohibiting the nurses from giving her pain medications. Even though he was no longer her legal spokesperson, his menacing demeanor made the nurses feel threatened, so they abided by his demands. Once again, his sister sprang into action and informed the staff Dan was no longer allowed to visit their mother. The facility security guard would ensure he did not have access. By the time Mrs. Dahl had arrived at the nursing home, she was already transitioning. Now, several days later, she was actively dying. With Dan no longer stopping the nurses from being able to medicate her adequately, she finally appeared to be comfortable, but she did seem to be in a holding pattern and unable to let go and die. I made my daily visit to her one afternoon and found her still unresponsive, still looking like she was standing at death's door, but still hanging on. I was finishing up my assessment of her and heard a commotion coming from the nurse's station just a short way down the hall. Dan had returned and was demanding to see his mom. This time he had a friend with him. It seemed like an effort to show force, but the nursing staff were undaunted and unwavering. I'm sorry, sir, an older nurse told him. We've been told we can't let you in. Turned to a younger nurse. Please call Rob, the security guard, and ask him to come up here. Hey, man, Dan's friend said. Let's just go. He turned to the nurse at the front desk. It's okay. We don't want any trouble. We'll leave. He just wants to see his dying mother, he told her. The nurse wasn't moved. Well, he can't come in because he won't let us take care of her. Dan looked like he had been physically wounded, but he didn't argue. He lowered his head and quietly left the building. I followed him outside and found him leaning against a wall near the entrance. This is when I put my hands on his shoulders and emphasized the bottom line. Your mom is dying, and if you want to be with her, you have to stop getting in the way of her care. Dan, do you hear what I'm saying? I asked. My hands were still on his shoulders as I looked into his eyes, and I could see tears beginning to form. I just need to be with her. I just need to be able to tell her goodbye. He started to sob quietly, and I could feel my heart breaking for him. If you promise that you will not interfere with the nurses medicating or doing anything to care for her, I said, I can see if I can get you back in to be with her. Dan's head snapped up. Yes, he almost shouted as he brushed off a tear with the back of his hand. I promise. After a phone call with Mrs. Dahl's daughter and reassuring the staff at the nursing home he wouldn't be a problem anymore, I guided Dan to his mother's bedside. He pulled up a chair next to the bed and sat down, taking her hand in his. I'm here, Mom, he said gently, leaning over her and resting his head on her chest. I love you so much. I put my hand on his shoulder. I'm going to say goodbye to you both now. Somehow I knew that Mrs. Dahl was getting what she needed and that I wouldn't be back. Dan lifted his eyes, and for the first time I could see some kind of peaceful resolution in his eyes. Thank you, he said quietly. Thank you, I thought, for letting my patient end her journey peacefully. Mrs. Dahl died an hour later with Dan still holding her hand.
Mm. That whole scene just punched me in the gut when I read it because everybody deals with death differently, right? But what a great example of what we were just talking about and the opportunity that you had to help him help his mom in her final days and final hours.
Yeah,
Absolutely beautiful.
yeah.
Why did you pick that one specifically?
I mean, that's definitely one that's I've never forgotten. It's so memorable. I think it's inspiring. I think it really speaks to how important it is to be able to get to that place of accepting that your person will die because grief can really, limit your ability to behave appropriately, um, and 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 can prevent you from really being with your person, even not just emotionally, but physically in this case, it almost stopped him from being able to be with her. And she needed that. She needed for him to be there. It was evident that he was a mama's boy. She loved him and she doted on him. And it was, obvious that she needed him to be there before
Yeah,
she could end
yeah.
end her life.
And probably okay to some degree, okay with her dying
Yes.
or leaving,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yep.
I have
Absolutely.
a dear friend of mine just recently went through this within the last week. As a matter of fact, her mother-in-law recently passed and was in hospice for the last few days. Unfortunately, my friend knew enough to tell the whole rest of the family that lived in a completely different state, look, we have to go. Like we have to go and we have to be able to say goodbye to her because there's a good chance that she's hanging on for that. And within 24 hours, she did pass. So I think it's absolutely amazing how we give so little credit. Just because they seem like they're not in there doesn't mean they're not in there, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that is one of the, you know, um, really amazing things about people dying is that they do seem to sometimes have a little bit of control over when they actually die. They wait for people to get there, or even I've seen it more often where they wait for people to leave. They'll be holding vigil and everybody's like, well, when's this gonna end? Like, how long is this gonna go on for? And they step out of the room for a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes and the person dies while they're gone. And I've had so many people too who said, I tried to get to my person. I broke the speed limit trying to get there and still I didn't make it on time and they have so much guilt for not being there. And I always say, look, if they need you to be there, they'll wait for you to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think our culture gets wrong about grief and death?
I think that it's something to be feared,
Mhm.
that it's something to be feared that we shouldn't talk about it. I think that's probably the main thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that's born mostly of fear?
Yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like what came first, the chicken or the egg, we have this fear around death, so we don't talk about it, which creates more fear around death because it's unknown to us.
Right.
We're always going to fear the unknown, where
So then we just avoid.
exactly, it's taboo. If you don't want to talk about it, it must be really bad. So that's why, it just creates this perpetual cycle of fear.
Yeah. In your chapter, the woo-woo stuff, I know I've listened to some of your other podcasts and everybody loves this part. And I hope you're not I hope we're not bored of talking about it because I
No.
too love this part. You talk about the spiritual experiences that people often have when death is near. How has witnessing these experiences changed you? And please feel free to share as many of them as you are comfortable sharing, without giving away too much of your book, of course.
Well, it has changed me because, as I said, I had death anxiety that partially stemmed from, you know, not knowing what happens after we die and worrying about that, like not having a concept of an afterlife. And when you see people who are visioning, you 100% believe that they see what they say they're seeing. It's profound. It's you can't even like I can't even if I say to somebody, this is amazing, you won't believe it, but you'll believe it. It still isn't even as impactful as watching it yourself, like seeing that yourself when you see somebody actually, like there's somebody right here, you know, it's my aunt, it's my mom, it's whoever. Um, they're so convincing. It's uncanny. It's just unbelievable. One of the most amazing things that actually didn't, I don't think I wrote about in my book was when a woman was dying and her adult daughters were in the room and they said that she kept talking about a baby girl and they don't know who that could be because they don't know of any baby girls that died. And then her sister came to visit and her sister said she had a baby when she was a teenager and it was a stillborn. And so it was like a family secret that was revealed on her mom's deathbed, on their mom's
Wow.
deathbed by their mom.
Unbelievable. That's incredible. Can you share a little bit about, I mean, you had a personal experience with this with your own dad. Do you mind sharing a little bit of that story?
Yeah, and I can tell you a little bit more to it too, because and this didn't make it in my book. It wasn't just me that experienced my dad, and it was my sister and my mom as well, and they had different experiences. So mine was about 3 weeks after my dad died, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. He came to me when I was sleeping, and he was brilliant energy, like warm, bright orange, just brilliant. So I didn't see his face. I just felt him there. And then I heard his voice and he said, "It's time to go." And I said, "Oh, well, okay. I'm going to have to tell the kids they're really going to miss me." And he said, "No, no, it's not time for you to go. It's time for me to go." And I said, "Oh, okay. I love you." And he said, "I love you." And he was saying, "I love you, honey. I love you, honey," calling me honey, which he never called me honey. And then my husband said, woke me up, and he was calling me honey too. And I was like, neither of them have ever called me honey, which I thought was so strange. And he said, um, "You were talking to your dad." And I said, "No, my dad was talking to me. He was here." So that was the like first experience anyone in my family had with my dad coming back. And they were kind of like, "Why you? Why not us?" And I said, "Well, because I've been a hospice nurse for 5 years. I'm connected to death. Like I'm closer to it. I'm open to it." So then my sister started having some problems. Actually, they had been ongoing for a long time, but my niece, her daughter, was using drugs, and it was a terrible, terrible situation. And my sister, was a single mom, raised her daughter on her own, and was just struggling so hard with what to do. She was facing having to evict her out of the house that she bought for her to rent. She was facing having to like get emergency custody of her granddaughter. It was just horrible situation. And so her husband started helping her meditate. And she said the first time she meditated, she saw a bench and she saw my dad sitting on the bench next to a dark figure. And she said, "I don't know what to do." And my dad said, "Laura, you know what to do." And that's all she needed because she knew what to do. She just needed this validation. And so she started this process of, evicting her daughter and getting custody. And every time that she meditated, she would see my dad next to the dark figure. But she said, my dad became more and more transparent, and eventually he was gone, and it was just the dark figure sitting there. Now, my sister has been not only not religious, she's been anti-religion, anti-God. She was an atheist, pretty much, or agnostic, you know. And to this day, she says, I didn't believe in God, but I believe in God now. And she said, God was sitting on that bench next to Dad. And it changed everything. And also, spoiler alert, and I should have given this in the beginning. My niece has been sober and clean off drugs for 10 years now, and she got her daughter back, had another one. I mean, it's all been a wonderful, wonderful experience, you know. And then
I'm
my mom,
I was just going to say, I'm so happy to hear that. It's like he was just encouraging her along to take the
yeah,
steps that are the hardest thing in the world for a mother to do, right?
yeah,
But
yes, yeah. I
likely
mean,
exactly what.
the rest of us were telling her, you know, because I went through this with my stepdaughter, and I was like, you've got to cut the strings. You have to. And she just couldn't do it. And it wasn't until like my dad came to her and said, you know what to do. She was able to do it. So my mom then was like, how come you guys and not me?
Mhm.
So a couple years after his death, actually several years after his death, my mom said, I keep seeing these little wisps. And I said, what is a wisp? And she goes, I don't know. I just see this little wisp. And I hear dad's voice, and he'll say something like, now you be careful, you know, because she's out mowing the lawn or whatever, you know. And so this went on for a while where she was like seeing these little wisps, you know, but I don't believe in an afterlife. And finally, one day I said, it was like a year after she had first started telling us about this. And I said, do you still have those little wisps? And she goes, not as much as I used to. I go, what do you think that was, Mom? Well, I don't know because I don't believe in an afterlife. And I said, well, you did say you thought it was Dad. And she goes, well, yeah, I kind of think it's Dad. And I said, well, then you believe in an afterlife.
Right, busted.
Yeah, yeah. Now, my brother never had any experience with my dad, and he is an atheist, and he's like full blown, don't believe in an afterlife. When we're dead, and that's it. And I think you have to be open to receiving, you know, the message or the visit, if you want to call it that, or whatever, or you're not going to experience that.
Right.
And
Or
he's
you'll
okay
chalk it
with
up to
that.
something else, right? You'll
Yeah,
blow it off or, dismiss it as something else. No, I agree
yeah.
completely.
And even people who are but who believe in an afterlife can dismiss it. I asked my husband recently if he ever experienced anything like that with his dad, and my husband's a Christian, so he believes in heaven, and so I think he dismissed it because he didn't think that fit with what his belief is. But he said that he saw his dad, um, like through a window or something like that, say something to him one time, and I was like, was probably him,
Hmm.
you know, when he was sleeping. So a lot of people get these experiences, you know, either when they're sleeping or meditating. That's really common. That psychic mediums will say that those visits that happen while you're asleep are really common. And it's not
Sure.
like a dream. You know, like when you wake up from that, you're not like, oh, that was a vivid dream. It's an experience for
It's an
sure.
experience. Yeah, I had
Yeah.
one myself about a year after my grandmother died. I was very, very close to her. This was several years ago. Really the only experience that I've ever really had like that. But it was absolutely profound. And when you have it, there's no forgetting it. And nobody, God Himself could come down and would not be able to convince me that it was anything other than what my heart says it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
know, you know.
Yep. Yep. For sure.
It's incredible to have been able, for you to have been able to witness so many of them. I'm sure it's just done amazing things for your spirituality.
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, it's funny because people would say, what do you think about near-death experiences? And I always thought of near-death experiences in terms of people who died and then came back. And then one day I realized what I have witnessed all these years are near-death experiences. My patients are near to death, and that's what it is.
Yeah, I think you're right. What were some of the biggest, let's dive into your writing process now, if you don't mind. What were
Okay.
some of the biggest challenges that you faced while writing your book?
Well, the biggest challenge was finding a literary agent and trying to get it published. That was a huge challenge, and I finally ended up going with a hybrid publisher because I couldn't. I did get a deal offer, and I it wasn't very much. Wasn't certainly was not what I was hearing was kind of the norm for the other hospice nurse influencers who were getting book deals.
Hmm.
Um, but the what really I didn't like about it was that they didn't want me to write the book I wanted to write. Uh, People will say a memoir is only for somebody who's famous. Nobody wants to read a memoir by somebody who's not famous, which is total and complete crap.
Total
I've read
crap.
lots of
Yep.
memoirs about people who were not famous at all, so I don't believe that at all. And I had pretty much already written the book by the time I was, shopping it. And I was really happy to turn down the offer and just pursue getting it published on my own. I'd rather pay to publish it and publish something that is true to what I want to put out there in the world.
Hmm.
So that part of, I think that was the biggest thing. And then also, like just organizing it, the editing and making sure I'm big on, I don't like Department of Redundancy department. It drives me crazy. So constantly, and this is just like ADHD, OCD brain, just constantly editing and re-editing and re-editing, and had my daughter help me for a long time. We went through the whole book together, and then I did get, through the hybrid publisher, I had a developmental editor, I had a copy editor, I had proofreaders. So I had all of that. So just really organizing it and making sure that it made sense to me. So I shuffled things around a lot to make sure that it felt like it flowed the way I needed it to flow.
Yeah, that structure piece, man. In writing my own, I will say that is my biggest challenge. Just when I think
Mhm.
got it licked, I decide I want to do something totally different. And I'll probably keep going back to the drawing board for the next 30 years. I don't know if it will ever hit a press because I just get so obsessed with it, because I'm convinced there's always just a better way to do it. So it sounds like in the end, you had a pretty good publishing experience. I have heard horror stories though of like the creative control that writers have had to relinquish in order to get their books published.
Yeah, that's why I was happy to do it the way that I did it. I
Mhm.
mean, and I was lucky. It's expensive to use a hybrid publisher,
Mhm.
but I'm fortunate in that I have my social media and I do earn money from that. So the really it didn't cost me anything in terms of household money or my paycheck from my regular job. It was all paid for through my social media business. And I have a big social media platform and I'm good at marketing. So I've been able to, sell a lot of books on my own. But yeah, I've heard that too, that you you don't get to write what you necessarily want to write. Uh, the big publishing companies aren't actually as willing to throw a lot of money at marketing as one would think that they are. Uh,
Especially for the amount that they take of your sales, because
mhm.
some people think that authors make a lot of money, but unless you're like a J.K. Rowling,
Yeah.
you hit it big, you're not making a lot of money, and especially if you go with one of the major publishing companies, because they take a significant portion of your profit.
Right. Unless you can get a really great advance, uh, you're not going to make very much money. And hybrid publishing, too. I mean, it's going to be a while before I recoup back what I put into it. But it for me really again wasn't really wasn't about making a lot of money. It was about just putting a book out there that I think will be helpful to a lot of people.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Making sure it hits as many hands as possible.
Yeah.
Oh, I agree. What do you wish you'd known before you started?
Oh, I don't know. I can't I can't think. I don't know. I can't answer that. I don't know what I would say to that. What do I wish I would have known before I started? There isn't really anything I can think of that I wish I would have known. Um, it's gone really well, and I don't think there's been any surprises for me in the way that I did it.
Okay. Good to hear.
Maybe one thing I would say is I wish I would have known. Nah, it doesn't matter. Having an email, like a mailing list on a website,
Hmm.
can help you. Like I
Hmm.
maybe that'd be the one thing I wish I would have had my website up and running, you know, I did have
prior
it
to
up
launch?
prior to, yeah, like if you have a website with a lot of mailing, people on your mailing list, that's really helpful because if you're relying on social media, like I do, to market, having, you know, the way the algorithm works is people will sometimes see your videos and sometimes they won't see your videos. And so even now, like as I'm continuing to always promote it, like on TikTok Live or Facebook Live, people will be coming in my comment section. They're like, they've been following me for years. Oh, you wrote a book? Yeah, I did. It's been out since January and I was doing pre-sales since October. So not everybody knows about it, but had I had, like a mailing list, that would have been another way to reach people. That's the only thing I can really think
Okay,
of.
I feel like that's kind of a big piece of advice to anybody who's aiming to accomplish that goal. What kind of advice would you give to someone who wants to write about loss and transformation? Like maybe they're not sure where to start.
Well, I mean, I think the way that you start any book, no matter what it's about, is just start writing what comes to you, and then you worry about where it fits later. Um, that's kind of how I did things too. Like I just wrote, and then you figure out where it goes. Like write everything down that you want to write down, and then you worry about editing through it later on. Um,
Together
like
later on.
yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, don't wait to start writing because you're trying to figure out what your perfect intro is going to be.
Mm.
So that's something. Like if you're trying to, one thing about publishing with publishers and finding a literary agent is that you have to have an idea of what your book is going to be about. You have to submit a proposal. And so you have to have like the chapters kind of figured out like what's this going to be? What's this going to be? What's this going to be? And that's really hard to do before you've started writing a book because you're not exactly sure how it's going to go.
And it will change
So,
even if you think you are. Yeah.
right, exactly. So, yeah, you just start writing and you don't worry about like if you're writing something and you think, oh gosh, I got to start at the beginning. No, you can start at the end. You just start writing and whenever something comes to you. It depends on how people what their creative process is too. For me, my creative process is things pop in my brain and I need to get them down as soon as possible or they're gone and they won't come
Mm.
back. So, if that's how someone is, then that's the way to do it is to get it
Right.
down.
Yeah, get it down, get it pen to paper, get it documented, and you can figure out where to fit it in later. I would agree with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
What was the most surprising thing about releasing your story to the world?
Uh, most surprising thing about, well, so my my story that I've released has been over time, so it wasn't just my book. I've been releasing my story to the world since I started on TikTok. Uh, and so I think the most surprising thing for me is um, how I've been able to influence others and inspire others with my little old me, my little old story. That's been the most surprising thing that I have been able to change other people's lives by telling people how I changed my own life. I
Sure,
think that's been the most surprising thing to me.
sure. And it's so inspiring too, how one person can make such a difference for so many people.
Yeah.
What do you, we may have already covered this, but I wanted to circle back around just in case. What do you hope that readers will take away from your book?
Yeah, I hope that so what I said earlier was that they don't need to be afraid of death, right? That death can be a beautiful and sacred experience if you aren't afraid to talk about it and accept it, but also that we are not the equivalent of the mistakes that we've made. That's
Mm,
something else that I think is really important that I hope people get from my book. And I as much as said that in my book. Just because you do bad things, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. And you can come back from almost anything. You just persevere and you can come back from almost anything. And I think it's never too late. It's never too late to change your life. It's never too late to go back to school. I did it when I was 40 is when I became a nurse. I went to nursing school when I was 40. It's never too late. So,
Yeah. We didn't dig into it a whole lot, but you talk about it quite a bit in your book that you had a bit of a rough start to life. You with some substance abuse issues and
mhm.
maybe not the
Jail.
so you're right, some not so great decisions. So yeah, I mean that's absolutely inspirational as well.
Yeah, that's why I think it's important for people to, you know, so, it's sometimes I look at it like this on a smaller scale. When I was trying to quit smoking, you're trying to quit smoking, and then you go for a while, and then you have a cigarette, and then you're like, well, I guess I'm a smoker again.
Yep.
Or trying to quit drinking, same thing. Trying to quit drinking. Oh, I went out and had cocktails last night. Well, I guess I'm still an alcoholic. You just have to keep on trying
Yep.
to change things. You just have to keep on trying to turn your life around, and eventually you're able to. You can't give up on yourself.
That's right. What was a book that changed your life? If it's a personal story, that's great, but it doesn't have to be.
Uh, so I'm terrible with remembering things because I'm so old.
You are not that old. You are not that old.
Um, but one of my favorite books that was so impactful to me, um, I have to, what's his name? Oh, okay. Um, Let me tell you. His name is J.S. Park, and he is a chaplain, and he wrote a book called As Long as You Need Permission to Grieve. And it didn't necessarily change my life, but it really changed a lot of how I think about things. And it's an amazing book. It's such an amazing book. I really recommend it to anybody. And I had the opportunity to meet him too, which was great. Because when I met him, I saw him speaking at a conference, and then I found out he was doing a book signing after, and I was just completely mesmerized by his presentation. Like, he was so good. And I walked up to go introduce myself and meet him. And I walked up and he said, "Oh my God, it's hospice nurse Penny. I love you. You're my favorite hospice nurse." I was just like, what?
You're TikTok famous.
Totally blew me away. I'm like, here I am going ready to fangirl over him, but he's written other books as well. But I mean, that book was so enlightening. I mean, it's just an amazing book. I really, really love it. And then Being Mortal by Atul Gawande, that's a real good one too. That's a life changer too. I love that one. And something that really inspired me a lot was uh, I'm Glad My Mother Died by Jeanette McCurdy.
Gosh,
Uh,
that was so good.
Reading that book really helped me a lot because as I was writing my book, which if you read it, there's some dark humor in it, and I'm kind of dark humor is my jam, and you never know how that's going to be received. It's received well on social media by all the people who follow me. But I read her book and I was like, okay, that book right there felt like my book, like how I'm writing my book in that
Mm-hmm.
same type of, you know, just kind of like dark,
Yep.
sometimes real dark humor and
She
but
did an excellent job of it too.
yeah,
I don't know if you listened to the Audible version or if you read it,
I did. I
but
did.
oh my gosh, the Audible version there's something about
Yeah.
listening to somebody read their own story that just gets to me anyway, but she did such a phenomenal job. That's a great book.
Yeah. I only listen to audiobooks, and people send me books all the time, because I'm an influencer, so they'll send me books, and I don't have time to read a book, but I do drive a lot. And so I listen to audiobooks all the
Yeah,
time. And yeah, I've listened to it twice actually. It was so good. I've listened to it 2 times. So
that's a good
I
one.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, where can people find you? Where can we get a copy of your book?
So I have a website, hospicenursepenny.com. It also has a lot of resources on there for hospice and death and dying, and it lists the events that I'll be at, book signing events, speeches I'm doing, I am on social media at Hospice Nurse Penny on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And my book is available anywhere books are sold online. So it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Tertulia. It is in audio. I recorded it myself because, as you said, listening to somebody tell their own story. And I did a better job reading it than I did reading the chapter a little while ago. It's hard to do an audiobook. Let me just tell you, you have no idea what it's like to record an
I
audiobook
can
until you
imagine.
it's
I can
so
imagine.
hard. Oh my gosh, it's really hard, but it was really fun. So that's on Audible, audiobooks, books.com,
Great.
anywhere you can get audiobook.
Okay. And we'll put all of your links to all of your stuff in the show notes as well. So I understand from reading your book that you are retired now in the Pacific Northwest, off grid.
Just
Yeah.
about June 3rd is my last day. I bumped it out.
Okay.
I was going to retire on April 1st.
Hmm.
And then my organization's going through some big changes, and I was needed to stay a little longer. But I'm definitely June 3rd is it. That's my last day. And I am actually have just sent my resume to another hospice agency that sees patients in my area. My hospice does not serve my area,
Hmm.
but because I'd like to do like per diem nursing, which is occasional, like a couple days a month, when needed type of nursing. So that's
Not
something
done
I'm
yet.
looking
Yeah, you
into.
said in your book that you're not retiring to retire from hospice nursing. It's because you didn't want to fight the traffic anymore. You
Right.
kind of wanted to get
Yeah.
away from civilization, right?
Yeah.
Anything else on the horizon for you other than
Just
potentially some addition? Like, I don't know if you'll add that to this memoir and put out a new version or maybe a second edition.
Yeah, at first everybody's like, you got to write another book. And I'm going, I don't have another book in me. And also, it's like telling a woman who just had a baby that, she should
Time to
have
have another
another baby.
baby.
You should have another kid, like, no, that's okay. But, but yes, I have been starting to think about maybe a friend of mine is an author also, and she's a hospice nurse and a death doula. And she was the one who said, now that you've proven yourself as an author, you can write your own ticket. You can probably get a deal with a publishing company. When I'm not under contract with my current publisher anymore, I might start shopping for a new literary agent and maybe do a second edition because there are a lot more stories that I could put in this book. So I've thought about that because I thought, how can you write a second memoir? I mean, I kind of ended it right there, like I guess if I live another 10 years, I'll write another memoir for the next 10 years. But um, I don't know. I thought about maybe just doing a second edition. I don't know. And I might, yeah, I don't know yet. Lots of things.
Well,
Haven't
I
really
will make
decided.
sure and go sign up on your email list so I know when that's coming if
Yes.
if it happens.
Yeah, that's how you'll find out. Yes, definitely. People should get on my mailing list because I always say, listen, you'll get on my mailing list and you'll get an introductory email, and then you'll probably never hear from me again unless it's something really important because I'm not big on spamming people with email. I'm just not into it. I don't like it when it happens to me.
Right.
So if you get anything from me, it means something really important is happening.
Great. Good to know. Well, Penny, it's been an absolute pleasure. I want to thank you again so much for coming on to talk to me. You are a gem. I have so much respect for what you have done with your life and the dedication that you have given to both your patients and really their families. I think that's where your primary relationships come in. We need more pennies in this world, more nurse pennies for sure.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for your time. Thanks so much for listening to For Love of Memoir. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, follow, and share the show. It really helps us reach more memoir lovers like you. You can find links to today's guest, their work, and anything we mentioned in the episode right in the show notes. Until next time, keep writing your story.